Does the Bible condone slavery? Some say yes, some say no, some say sort of. I believe the Bible both condones and condemns the institute of slavery. In the Old Testament, slavery is mostly discussed in the law of Moses, found in Exodus, Leviticus and Deuteronomy. It is explored in Exodus 21, Leviticus 25 and Deuteronomy 15 and 23. Exodus chapter 21 verses 2 to 11 and 26 to 27 discuss how slaves can be freed. Leviticus 25 verses 39 and 44 to 46 discuss who can be slaves. Deuteronomy 15 verses 12 to 18 is similar to Exodus but adds what masters must do for the slaves. And chapter 23 verses 15 and 16 talks about escaped slaves. These verses seem to point to the idea of freeing slaves. Does that mean God wanted the Israelites not to have slaves? No, it doesn't. God allowed them to. It says in Leviticus 25 verse 44, you may acquire male and female slaves. However, it confirms that only people from pagan nations could be slaves, not Israelites. Despite these slaves being pagans, the laws command that they should be treated with respect, which isn't a surprise as the law of Moses also has laws commanding the Israelites to treat free foreigners with the same level of respect as themselves. The apostles didn't agree with slavery but accepted it. Paul, Peter and the other apostles in their letters saw the institute as unavoidable, since the Roman economy was built on it, and you causing an uprising about it would damage Roman society, hence showing Christianity as a threat to the elite Romans. Paul in Ephesians chapter 6 verses 5 to 8 talks about how he believes slaves should conduct themselves in line with Christ's desires. He says, slaves, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling in the sincerity of your heart, as to Christ, not by way of eye service as men pleasers, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. With good will render service as to the Lord, and not to men, knowing that whatever good thing each one does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether slave or free. He tells the slaves living in Ephesus to submit to their master's demands, and complete the task given to the best of their ability, because all this is the will of God. Paul doesn't state whether this applies if the masters are unreasonable or cruel. However, Peter does, saying in 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 18, servants, be submissive to your masters with all respect, not only to those who are good and gentle, but also to those who are unreasonable. This might sound strange. Why would God desire this? Paul explains in verse 8 of the passage above, and Peter in the following verse says, for this finds favour, if for the sake of concise toward God, a person bears up under sorrows when suffering unjustly. It's clear that both Peter and Paul agree that those slaves suffering at the hands of their masters is wrong, and that God will reward all who do. In verse 9 of Ephesians chapter 6, Paul states what's required of the masters. And masters do the same thing to them, and give up threatening, knowing that both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him. Like the slaves, Paul confirms that God is watching the masters and expects them to show respect towards those under them, because God is the true master and will judge both masters and slaves based on their conduct. Does the Bible condone slavery? It's clear that both the Old and New Testaments condone the institute of slavery. However, condoning doesn't mean agreeing. I believe especially in the New Testament the apostles condemned the practice, yet instead of demanding all the slaves to be freed, decided to slowly but surely transform, developing it into something like an employer-employee relationship we have today. The Old Testament doesn't condemn it in the same way, but for the most part condemns the industry's cruelty, advocating a more humane approach unlike those in the surrounding nations.